Hello everybody, John here, and today I thought I'd share with you an overview of my future RedBull Soapbox Challenge competitor, my Gravity Racer. You guys have seen this on the wall since the beginning of my channel, so while we're having a bit of a rearrange, I thought I'd share with you my Gravity Racer, which is another ongoing project. I've never been a good welder, but since professionally I've never had a need to use welding, it sort of got really rusty, excuse the pun, over years. And I thought, well, I want to do a little project to get me back up to speed on welding again. So I decided to make a Gravity Racer, sort of thing that some of you see on the RedBull challenge, that sort of thing, for basically engineless propulsion as fast as possible down a course that's usually got bends and twists and banks and the odd jump and bump in it. And if you guys like me get excited watching it on the telly, I'm sure you're shouting out at the screen, oh bloody hell, what about that design? You should have thought of that, etc, etc. I'm no better. I thought, well, I can definitely do better than that. Not as easy as it looks, to be fair, but yeah, this is my basic chariot, which I do have aluminium clothing to dress it in. I'll share with you another day maybe what that's going to look like while I'm doing it, but it's a very long-term project. I just pick it up when I fancy it and then carry on. So what have I done? If any of you watch this sort of thing on the telly, you'll know that the thing that fails on almost all of them is the wheels. So what we've done is we've gone for 20-inch multi-laced extra strong BMX wheels. These things are big enough to give low rolling resistance, but small enough not to pringle, as I call it, bend in half. Given that they're multi-laced as well, they're pretty strong things. Next, we've single side axled them. This has been achieved by removing the bicycle bearings and fitting car bearings both sides inside the hubs, and then pulling them up with Unbreako branded high tensile steel bolts, which go into threaded uprights with a lock nut on the back so I can adjust the tension. And well, I've got tyres and tubes which will allow over 100 psi, and that's because the rolling resistance of your vehicle, you can do all the calculations you want, but the fastest downhill chariot will be the one with the roundest wheels. And by round, if it's got a pneumatic tyre, the bottom is always relatively flat. So if you can have a tyre with a high crown profile, so this is not a point, it's not a tube, because I do want some grip, but it's very radiused, and very high pressure, then you keep the rolling resistance to an absolute minimum. I've got disc brakes on all 4 wheels, although you see there's no calipers on these at the moment. That's the next stage of my welding, is I've got to mount the carriers for the front brakes. The back brakes are complete. That's probably not best shot. There we go. That's a little better. There's the caliper on the back brake, and they're mounted, I don't know if you can see, they're on ball mounts, so they're going to be adjusted every which way to eliminate any drag whatsoever on the mechanism. Basically, if this lever is pulled back, then the calipers squeeze, and the little red bits you can see here, the ends of the brake pads sticking out, and that is connected to an adjustable cable on an arm linked to the rear upright. I've built the thing so that it's basically set up for 4-wheel steering, but that's so that I can dial out any toe in, toe out on it to minimise drag, and also tailor the suspension setup. I really enjoy suspension, by the way. I'm rather sad in that regard. So that under various suspension angles, it's still pointed perfectly forward. So we've got right and left hand threads in these little bars, linked with rose joints, and it can be locked off, and that basically adjusts the toe in, toe out of the rear wheels. If you're not into your suspension like sad people like me, I'm looking down from above. Toe in, this is the front. Toe in would be if this wheel did that and pointed towards the middle of the cart, and obviously that would scuff. Getting that perfectly aiming straight forward is the job of this link, which winds the wheel in and out. You'll notice some, it's very rusty, it's only surface rust. I live near the sea. Some of the components look perfectly preserved, like this, and that's because I powder coated them in my homemade powder coating booth, which is more of an experiment at this stage than anything, and it really does give it excellent protection. It looks quite sharp. And the suspension, again, look at the back. We've got unequal length wishbones. They're longer at the bottom than they are at the top. This is to try and keep the wheel upright and following a standard track. We've got some rather rudimentary top pivot points, and we've got rose jointed bottom pivot points, meaning again I can extend the length of this arm, front and rear, to adjust the suspension. Come around the back, just move my Keith Robinson seat out of the way for now. There we go, that's better. What you can see is we've got inboard suspension, and it operates the opposite to what you might imagine. So the top link of the suspension runs through this pivot over here, and when the cart goes down, it's quite heavily sprung. I might have to use my foot. There we go. So that's going up and down. One of the brake calipers is on the front of the wheel. The other rear brake caliper is on the back of the wheel. And that's because these are bicycle calipers and not intended for lefts and rights. So to make them operate correctly, I've had to switch them over. So one's in front and one's behind the wheel. The springs are mountain bike springs, rear shocks, and are adjustable for spring rate, start position, so basically going high-low the vehicle, pre-compression, harder or softer suspension, and they have dampers. The front suspension is even more ridiculously complicated. Why? Because I wanted to. So very little unsprung weight to make it very flexible at the front. Again, you watch these things on the telly, people go over jumps and bumps and immediately destroy their vehicles. This one, not a chance. You can literally drop this from 6 foot up in the air and like a Tamiya radio controlled car, the whole, that's the sound of the seat bouncing. The whole thing is just protected from that impact massively. So uprights, rose joints, top and bottom. Look down from above, you'll see that the pivot point for the steering is not out here, it's back here. That's to create something called the Ackerman angle, meaning that when you steer, the wheels left and right have to go through a different angle. If they both went through the same angle, then you would be having them fight each other, because the inside wheel describes a much smaller, or should describes a much smaller, tighter turn than the outside wheel. So by pulling those joints to a very particular position, what you achieve is, if I turn the steering, by the way, it's a Jag. If I turn the steering, what you'll see is totally different angles on both front wheels. Straight above, outside wheel describes quite a shallow turn. Inside wheel now describes a very acute turn, and that angle's precisely worked out to mean that at all times they're describing the right radiuses to minimise the scuff effect of the tyres and reduce drag. Inboard front suspension, again, minimal for unsprung weight, making the suspension very active, keeping the outside nice and clean, and reverses the action, the forces. So as the vehicle goes down, those inner arms press down onto the dampers and cause them to compress. The various holes to allow different spring rates. When I was setting the thing up, I wasn't quite sure what sort of rate I would need. From back round to the back for a moment, the spring rates back here are achieved, and it's crudely executed, but nonetheless interesting piece of design. The top of the shocker is mounted to this box, which can be slid along the inboard arm, thus giving me completely variable rates. So if I slide this box over here, I will get a little lever from the pivot point, pushing down and squeezing the spring very easily. As I move further out to above this pivot point, it gets harder and then reverses when I go further out the other way. So I've got infinitely variable spring rates. The braking, you'll note the two cables from the two rear brakes runs through large holes in the back of the tube to small holes in the front of the tube. And if I just take the rather temporary seat out for a moment, those two cables go to a splitter which balances the load and takes the pull from a single point back here and balances out the pressure on those two cables. The controls, so we've got a dicky bow, I think people would call this, steering. That's to allow for the lowest possible design of the bodywork, so you can get your knees underneath and it doesn't fail too badly. And at the moment, this just has two levers on it, upside down levers. This one is for the rear brakes. This one will be for the front brakes, and the tops, which are blocked off, will be to put a button in there for an electric horn, and on the other side something just cosmetic to do with the shape of the body. I'm doing a little bit of entertainment, if you like. In the front we've got a little checker plate footwell. I'm going to clad the whole vehicle in aluminium, but this is going to be kind of a strong point to make sure that there's no way your feet ever going to punch through anything here, or anything punches through to your feet and causes you harm. Again, based on watching other people destroy their chariots when you watch them on telly. Yeah, so just to again demonstrate the flexibility of the vehicle. It's very, very supple at the front end. You see the inboard front suspension working there. And the rear is a little firmer because I'll be sat there. And the steering, not only has it got that Ackerman angle going on, but it's been designed to give a high degree of camber as you steer. From that angle, actually, it looks like the front right has not moved at all. That's just a fisheye effect. But if I manoeuvre you guys, and you can see that the outer wheel is leaning in at the top. So as the pressures of going around the corner increase, so the tyre is rolled into contact, more vertical with the road, but also it's effectively making the car a little bit wider on the outside of the bend, impossible to roll. The inside wheel, which as discussed earlier is steering a lot harder, is also cambering, and is cambering significantly out at the top, again pushing the inside edge in, so moving over towards where the load is. So where it looks a little bit tatty, this thing should roll incredibly well. It will go over jumps and bumps with no issues. It's not going to fold up. It has got four-wheel disc braking, so it can stop, and should handle an absolute dream. I've only ever had it on little test runs down some very casual slopes, but it just shrugs everything off. Plus the steering is geared such that a large input on the steering gives a relatively small output from the wheels, which again, you see people trying to steer their vehicles and it just bouncing around. This won't do that.